What is the point of paying reparations now to, say, for instance, a young black woman like yourself? In what way do you need to be given recompense for what happened to perhaps some of your ancestors many years ago? Does Oprah Winfrey, as a black woman in America, a multimillionaire, billionaire, does she need to have reparations being paid?
I think
this debate cuts straight into one of the most politically explosive questions around reparations. How far should responsibility for historic injustice extend into the present? And who exactly should be paying for it? Lloyd's of London is facing scrutiny over its historic role in insuring slave ships, and the argument being made here is that modern institutions should help repair the damage created by that past. But Julia Hartley Brewer pushes on the part that often gets skipped. If the people alive today neither committed the original crime nor were directly enslaved by it, what is the principle that determines who owes what to whom? And once you start making reparations arguments through inherited guilt and inherited grievance, the logic gets complicated very quickly. Slavery involved African rulers, European traders, Arab slave networks, and multiple empires across centuries. So where does accountability begin? Where does it end? And how do you stop history from becoming an endless political invoice? That is the pressure point in this exchange. Watch how quickly the argument moves from historical responsibility into modern claims about institutional racism, inequality, and whether Britain should be judged more by its role in slavery, or by the fact that it later helped abolish it. Before we roll the clip, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Debate Central, and turn on notifications. Now let's get into it.
TB, of course. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
I'm not a fan of reparations. I'm not entirely sure that people in the 21st century should be apologising for and trying to make good for horrible things that happened in the past, because the past, pretty much until 100 years ago, was horrible for virtually everyone. Some people had it more badly than others, but pretty much everyone had a horrible, horrific, terrible life. And I'm not entirely sure what reparations do to solve that. Why do you think this is a good idea? 52 million quid.
Well, the thing is, the UK government only finished paying back compensation to slave owners. So that was owners of enslaved people who lost their commodities when slavery was abolished in 1833. We only finished paying that back in 2000.
It cost the country a fortune to abolish slavery.
For £300 million. £20 million in 1833, £300 million in today's money. So, and at that point, that was compensation paid back to slave owners. But at no point has any reparations been paid back. And I don't just believe that reparations should be money. I think it should be actions as well. But no reparations have been paid back to enslaved people and their descendants.
Well, there can't be to enslaved people because they died a long time ago.
Of course, and millions of African people died in the journey trying to just make it to the Americas, to the Caribbean, wherever.
Yeah.
And reparations, the definition of it is redressing gross violations of human rights, which enslaving millions of people was.
Clearly.
And it's not just about the money. It's also about redressing inequalities that exist today, which are a hangover, if you will.
And certainly, look, America, until very, very recently, I mean, only, in our lifetime, well, certainly my lifetimes, the people did not have equality as a result of that. Different situation here in the UK. We didn't import slavery. People who live in this country are people who have chosen to live in this country. But you're in a situation where, look, it was black Africans who sold other black Africans to white Europeans to sell to plantations in America. It was an appalling abomination of a crime. It has happened in every society, every empire, throughout history. It is still happening now. Far more black Africans were sold by Arab slave traders to go east. All of it was horrific and awful. Thank God we helped abolish it. I think Britain should stand proud in the world for the fact we were the first empire to say, no, we're going to abolish this. They paid the slave owners because that was the quickest and best way of stopping this trade. What is the point of paying reparations now to, say, for instance, a young black woman like yourself? In what way do you need to be given recompense for what happened to perhaps some of your ancestors many years ago? Does Oprah Winfrey, as a black woman in America, a multimillionaire, billionaire, does she need to have reparations being paid?
I think the point of reparations, like I said, it's about redressing this gross violation of human rights, which is something
you can't redress it. But it happened.
But that's exactly. But it's something that we, like you said, we cannot deny that has happened.
No one's denying it.
And there has to be some sort of compensation paid. We can't just sort of carry on like we are now and not redressing the inequalities, which are the hangover from slavery that exists now. So basically, you have inequalities in the NHS, in the police
inequalities
service.
in the NHS.
Yeah, huge.
Because of slavery.
But
the slave trade is responsible for inequalities in the NHS.
The slave trade is responsible for the institutionalized racism that we have in different institutions in the United Kingdom. And
why do we ask for reparations from African states that now exist now, or who are responsible for selling, rounding up, capturing other African people and selling them to white Europeans? Why don't we ask those states for reparations? Why don't we ask the Italians to pay for the invasions of the Romans and the enslavery of many people, the Celts and others here in the UK? I'm thinking, my family, I mean, this isn't a government payout, it's Lloyd's of London. They made millions from insuring ships carrying slaves. They literally insured, they regarded human beings, because they were black, as cargo, as cattle,
as commodity.
They were not considered human. It's a disgusting thing. The world has changed now. Britain is part of the reason why that changed. What on earth is the purpose of those reparations? Nobody living today is directly affected by slavery.
That's untrue, because, like I said...
By that slavery, there are people in slavery.
Because we still have the inequalities, which are the hangover of slavery. We still have the institutionalized racism in different sectors of society, which was started by having slavery in the first place, which was started by regarding people of African descent as cattle, as commodity, and using them as things rather than people. And
what about reparations for women? Women, until about sort of 70, 80 years ago, pretty much had no rights. We had the same rights as children, such as children had rights. We were basically owned by our fathers and then owned by our husbands. Until, certainly in my lifetime, it's been legal for men to beat their wives and rape their wives. When are we getting our reparations from all the men? Because we're living under that subjugation. It's at some point you have to have a cut-off point in history.
Yeah, you do have to have a cut-off point in history.
Yet.
I agree with that, but not just yet, because a lot of things that affect black people in this country, like I've said, and like I will keep saying...
Because apparently everyone in the NHS is racist. Philip,
I didn't say everyone in the NHS is racist.
I'm paraphrasing the nonsense.
The question is, where do you stop? And again, it's not all about skin colour, because you look at the Irish that were brought into Great Britain to build the roads, to build everything else, and in the 50s, it was very common as you went round. You saw on the boarding houses no blacks, no Irish, so we're grouped in together. So I think the issue is whenever we all try and
I just think when we're still harping on about the past, and again, there's the horrible crime took place. I don't think we can build for the future. That's what I fear. We're going to talk to you about this again another day.
And this is where the reparations argument becomes much more complicated than the moral certainty surrounding it often suggests. Nobody in this exchange is defending slavery. Nobody is pretending that Lloyd's of London's historical connection to the transatlantic slave economy is something to celebrate. The real disagreement is about what responsibility means generations later, and whether historic involvement creates a financial obligation in the present. That distinction matters. A modern institution can acknowledge an ugly chapter in its history. It can document that history honestly. It can decide to fund projects intended to address present-day disadvantage. But once that is described as reparations, an entirely different principle enters the conversation, that an identifiable debt created in the past remains payable today. And Julia's questioning exposes the difficulty of establishing where that principle stops. If responsibility can pass down through institutions and generations, then history becomes extraordinarily complicated. The transatlantic slave trade was not a simple story involving one country, one institution, or one group of perpetrators. As Julia points out, African participation in the capture and sale of enslaved people was part of that history as well. Other slave systems existed across the world. Britain itself eventually committed enormous resources to suppressing the trade. None of those facts erase British involvement. They do, however, complicate any political narrative that reduces centuries of history into a straightforward equation of modern perpetrator and modern victim. And that is where the exchange with Aisha becomes particularly revealing. Her strongest argument is not really that someone living today personally experienced 19th century slavery. It is that consequences originating in slavery survived abolition and contributed to inequalities that came afterward. That is a fundamentally different claim, because now reparations are being justified through present-day disparities, rather than direct compensation to an identifiable victim. But that creates another burden of proof. If a disparity in Britain today is being attributed to slavery, you have to demonstrate the connection rather than simply asserting it. When Aisha links institutional racism in organizations such as the NHS and police to slavery, Julia immediately challenges that causal chain. And politically, this is exactly where reparations advocates risk losing people who might otherwise readily acknowledge the horrors of slavery, because voters can accept historical wrongdoing without accepting that every modern racial disparity is its direct consequence. Those are not the same proposition. Julia also raises the comparison with women, and again, the point is not that every historical injustice is identical. They obviously are not. Her challenge is about consistency. Human history contains an enormous number of groups that were denied rights, exploited, conquered, displaced, discriminated against, or legally subordinated. If historical injustice itself creates an inherited financial claim, governments and institutions eventually need some coherent standard, explaining which injustices qualify, which descendants qualify, who pays, and when the account is considered settled. Without that standard, reparations can start looking less like justice and more like selective historical accounting. There is also another part of Britain's history that cannot simply be edited out, because it complicates the argument. Britain participated in the slave trade and British institutions profited from it. But Britain also abolished that trade and subsequently devoted significant resources to suppressing it. Serious historical discussion has to be capable of holding both facts simultaneously. That is increasingly important because public trust collapses when people suspect they are being given history as political instruction rather than history in its full complexity. People do not need their country presented as morally flawless. Britain clearly was not, but neither should acknowledging historical wrongdoing require pretending that national history consists exclusively of wrongdoing. And this is the wider political danger surrounding reparations. If the objective is reconciliation, the policy has to provide some definition of what reconciliation actually looks like. Does 52 million settle anything? Who determines whether the historical debt has been satisfied? Does another institution become responsible tomorrow? Does the argument eventually reach the government and therefore taxpayers who had no involvement whatsoever in the original activity? Those are not hostile questions. They are exactly the questions that should be asked whenever moral arguments become financial or political policy. Because acknowledging history and inheriting guilt are two very different things. Lloyd's can confront its historical record. Britain can teach the reality of slavery honestly. Modern discrimination, wherever it can actually be demonstrated, should be challenged on its own evidence. But none of that automatically proves that people living generations later should be divided permanently into hereditary categories of debtor and victim. And that is ultimately what Julia was challenging here. The past should be remembered accurately. Injustice should never be sanitized, but the political goal should surely be building a society in which individuals are judged as individuals, not creating an endless system where historical guilt and historical grievance are passed from one generation to the next. That is the real argument underneath this exchange, and it is far bigger than $52 million.